Maybe if we can have all the presenters as close to the front as possible so that, it's easy to just come up. So I think we will start right now. So let me check to see if all of the the presenters are around. So I know Dr. Piri is around. The next paper is Mr. Usman Al Hassan. Okay, you are around. Dr. J. Durga, also around. And Dr. Hal Mariam Tekulu, okay, around. And Dr. Martin Tabe Ojong, also around. Okay. So the final paper is Adaptation to Climate Change and Agricultural Productivity. Mr. Zhang Ao is virtual. Is he connected? So the last paper, the presenter is connecting virtually, so we just need to confirm he's online. Okay, good. All right, we are. Okay, we are good to go. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Usman Gajigo. I'm a manager in the research department of the African Development Bank. This session is on climate change and agriculture, and we have 6 very interesting papers that we presented in this session. I want to thank everyone for taking the time, and this is this session is highly relevant to this conference, to the theme of this conference. So time-wise, we have 1 hour 30 minutes. Apologies for the delay, but we started late, so it's sort of cascaded. It's very important we stick to the time so that we do not magnify the late schedule we have right now. So this means that every presenter and discussant needs to play their part in ensuring that we stay within the allotted time. So for each presenter, you will have 7 minutes. Each discussant will have 4 minutes, and then we will give 5 minutes to people who are present virtually and also physically to provide comments. And the presenters will each have 5 minutes to respond to comments, observations, or suggestions by those in the audience. Okay, so let's get started. The first paper is perceptions. The first paper is socioeconomic, institutional, and environmental enablers and barriers to climate-smart agriculture adoption and scaling in Kenya, Malawi, and Nigeria. And the presenter is Dr. Austin Piri. So please, let's give our attention to Dr. Piri. Thank
you. Thank you, the moderator, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will try to stick to time, 7 minutes. And so let's have all right, that's the title. I am Austin, that's my name. I come from Malawi. The economist comes from Nigeria, but she's not with us. Her name is Sarah. Let's go to the second slide. Sub-Saharan Africa is facing a lot of challenges because of climate change. Much of the agricultural systems rely on rainfall, and because of climate change, we are having challenges. Okay. However, climate-smart agricultural practices are showing promise to improve the well-being of farmers. But it's not clear what might encourage or discourage the adoption of these practices among the smallholder farmers. And so we purposed to determine the factors behind smallholder farmers' adoption of these practices, but also identify major enablers and obstacles that farming households have to overcome in order to implement these practices. The study was conducted in Kenya, Malawi, and Nigeria. We collected primary data, but also we did a desk study apart from the primary data that was collected using the household survey and focus group discussions and key format interviews. The total sample size was 445 respondents. That's an aggregate figure for all the countries. Data were analyzed using a combination of descriptive and inferential statistical methods. On multivariate probit regression, marginal rates of substitution based on coefficient estimates of multivariate probit model of CSA choices were utilized to determine the factors that drive the adoption of CSA and analyze the trade-offs that farmers make to address land degradation, enhance sustainability, and build resilience to climate change. On perceptions of the factors affecting CSA adoption, these came out: limited knowledge, limited access to training, limited access to resources or credit, high cost of inputs, and limited access to information. The findings agree with what others found, that the lack of adoption of these practices is compounded by information and knowledge-related challenges, since the interventions require adequate training and access to extension services. On opportunities for adoption of the practices, one, it's ownership of farming land through inheritance, looking at the figures there, but also up to 73% on aggregate of the land in these countries is arable. And so this might guarantee tenure security and usage, and therefore potential to promote CSA adoption over the long term is high. The key messages coming from the MVP analysis include: gender did not have a significant impact on adoption of the following practices: refuse retention, minimum tillage, green manure, and mulching adoption. And so this might imply that despite gender disparities, other factors may be responsible for the adoption of some of these practices. Looking at education level, that influenced the adoption of crop rotation, and thus farmers with higher education were more willing to adopt a crop rotation. But also increase in household size negatively influenced the adoption of crop rotation. Perhaps more people means perhaps more people implies more pressure and fragmentation of farmland, and therefore reduced area for practicing rotation. But conscious incorporation of leguminous crops into the soil was influenced by drought occurrence. Frequency of contact with extension agents had a positive influence on adoption of early maturing varieties and mulching. In conclusion, farmers appear not to easily change their agricultural methods due to challenges with technology use, slow adoption of innovations, or failure to understand the benefits of CSA techniques, but also factors including the environment, technology accessibility, farmers' socioeconomic features, attitudes and motives, as well as socio-cultural components had an impact on the adoption of these practices. However, the existence of frameworks and policy structures intended to promote climate-smart agriculture is among the significant potential that exists throughout the three countries. And the major obstacle is getting the expected results appears to be the implementation gap. And in order to foster inclusive involvement, it is more important to make sure that financing instruments are adequately matched to laws and plans like the Climate Change Acts and CSA country strategies. But also, most of the methods need a great deal of knowledge. Thus, encouraging their adoption will call for well thought out, inclusive and cutting edge knowledge management systems that support research and indigenous knowledge while facilitating information sharing strategies among the smallholder farmers. Yeah. This study was funded by the African Economic Research Consortium, and the authors are under the umbrella of the One Planet Fellowship. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for being exactly on time. I'll give the floor now to Dr. Jerry Wabiri, who is the discussant. Can you please come to the podium?
I think thank you for the opportunity to read such an interesting paper on CSA. In terms of, I think I don't want to start with the methods. I want to start with other things. But there was the selection, some of the within the countries, the selection was random, others was purposeful. And I think that can have an implications on the findings of the paper. In terms of the reporting, I think it is important to know that if 6% of what, because it could be that 6% of 2 people, or that 6% of 100 people, or that 6% of. So I think that is quite key. The paper is quite interesting apart from that, because that does impact on that. The other thing is, there is the issue of when did these people adopt the CSA, what was happening before then. It gives the context to the paper, and what happened after they adopted the CSA in terms of their yield, in terms of productivity, in terms of the benefits. I can see everything is there, but we need to understand, because then that also points to the question, how many of the farmers have scaled up the CSA? Because if they've been practicing it for more than one season or another, have they completely, some have practiced one, perhaps within the 2 years they discarded it, we don't know, and then they adopted it in the other year. What are the implications? What about scale? Because the issue is about scaling the CSA and the adoption of the CSA. In the conclusion, the issue of land is quite a key issue, but it's in the conclusion of the paper. I see you've touched it here. It doesn't come out strongly that it is one of the key recommendations. Maybe it's because of the smallholder farming. What is the average large size, farm size that you're talking about? It's not, it makes it a little bit difficult to do that. But in terms of policy, it would also be good to look at what policies government had before the introduction of the CSA. And somewhere along the line, if the policies changed, what are the implications? What have that changed in terms of either enhancing the issue. The greatest issue, of course, is institutional knowledge, limited access, lack of finances. But these are new technologies. And the question I had in my mind was, before the farmers are given this CSA, is there no training? Is there no feasibility? Is there no, why do we have to study it after we've given the farmers the technology? Maybe as an evaluation, because there has to be a baseline before you implement the CSA, and after. That way we can be able to see the benefit of the CSA, which is very clear, because I think in Africa we've had drought, we've had all these problems. So most of the variables, we need also to test for multicollinearity before we just bump all of them into a model. That's quite key, because then your model can be very significant because you have 10 or so variables, but there is the issue of what is confounding one against the other. We need to remove the effects, the control effects of other things in the model. But I think it's good. It points to the need to really have a thorough training of the farmers before they adopt the CSA, because it is good, but it can be dropped along the way depending on how the feasibility was done, how it was implemented. Because if it has worked somewhere, I tend to believe the paper maybe should go ahead and say, how do you scale it up? Depending on smallholder farmers, are we talking of 2 acres? Are you talking of my kitchen garden? Are you talking of 10 acres? That needs to be very clear, so that the decision maker can say, okay, it is working in 50,000 acres in Ethiopia. It should work somewhere else with similar conditions. So that my take is, from a systems perspective, you move up. If it doesn't work, you move up. Then we can, so that we know the social factors: finance, lack of knowledge, limited access to information. So my expectation is, this is known. What is it that we are bringing out? The technologies are working. I was hoping we can scale them. The conclusion is we need to scale them. We need to deal with this, but in terms of policy, we need to scale this in Kenya and not in Uganda or not in Malawi. And why did you choose 3? Why did you choose 4 in Nigeria? Why did you choose 3 in Kenya? I think those are just some few dynamics you can do to improve on the paper. But I think it's good. Push it a notch higher, and let's say what is scalable in terms of policymaker. You've given me so many choices. As a decision maker, I have very little money. As a farmer, I have to educate my children, ABCD. What should I focus on? I can't use all the 6 CSAs. Which one works in Malawi? Which one works in Kenya? What should I do as a farmer? I think that in terms of decision making, that should be key.
Thank you, Dr. Wabiri. So I will now open the floor to colleagues, in the audience. I think those who are also connected virtually may want to ask. So I already see two or three hands. May I get assistance in, for any, those who want to, yes. You need to turn the microphone on before you talk. So just please, if you can keep your questions, just a second, if you can keep your questions short and concise to the point, so that we give as many people as possible the opportunity to ask a question, because we only have 5 minutes and he has to answer the questions as well. So do I give like 3 people to answer and then you come back to them?
Thank you very much. I'm Sulaiman Yusuf. First, I would like to know how this can be generalized to those countries. You know, you picked, I'm from Nigeria. There are 2 small, the communities picked are 2 small communities, one in Ogun, one in Kaduna axis. And so you are using that to generalize for a country that has about 5 different agroecological zones. And perhaps are into different crops in terms of water regime, water requirement. So we need to know how replicable this is. And I didn't have time to read through this, but I want to know what crops are produced in each of the zones, because we need to know so that we can know whether the kind of CSA that you are claiming are actually applicable in those communities. Because if you look at it, the kind of crops produced, depending on the water regime, will determine the kind of climate smart agriculture or the kind of strategy they will adopt at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Francis Waswa, National Economist, UNDP. I'm a typical economist, so I'm a bit, my comments might be a little bit strange. But first and foremost, I was confused about the kind of theory that you used to inform the kind of variables. I saw in your presentation from your perceptions, there were a few issues that were pointed out, for example, to do with skills, to do with financing. But because you didn't show your model, I was not sure whether these variables were actually controlled for in your modeling. For example, the quality of the CSA that is being offered, the kind of entrepreneurship skills that these farmers might have. A farmer who is producing for subsistence vis-a-vis one who is producing for market, that might have an impact. The kind of social networks, it means you already have a selection bias. If you're in a community where there is nobody using that particular kind of CSA, and another community where that CSA is already existing, one farmer might learn from the other one. So the neighborhood effect. Financial inclusion, how financially included these households. The issue of women empowerment is also critical for these CSAs. It's a confounding factor. So I didn't see your modeling, so I don't know whether your probit estimations actually controlled for these factors. And if you did not control for them, then I think these are some of the important variables to consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm also an economist, but so I'm just extending from what is left. I'm interested actually to know what, I suppose I'm asking too much, but I would have actually loved to see what are the incremental benefits which are resulting from the adoption of the CSA relative to the systems which were there before. Because look, at the end of the day, we are all interested about food security, promoting exports, etc. So to that extent, if we are going to adopt this technology, then we need to know what is it that actually is coming in as a benefit, relative to the technology which existed before. So if this was not part of, the research, I noted that there was an economist there. I thought at a certain point, they should have actually included an analysis on that so that we are convinced that indeed this does well in these countries which it was done. Thank you.
I think we can take one more question before we go to the presenter. Yes, at the back.
And I hope I can sit down. Yeah.
That's okay.
I'm not an economist, but I'm perplexed at all of the things I'm hearing because what I'm wondering, and this is my first time in the African Economic Conference. So my question might sound a bit way off. It is to understand, is this an exercise in theoretical applications or is it an exercise in finding solutions to issues in the continent? Because if it is, I think some of the things that we are kind of examining makes no difference to the poor rural farmers or farmers all over the continent. So I hope that the outcome of this process is to inform what people really can do in terms of adopting good practices in agriculture. I think it's a no-brainer when we talk about smart agriculture, adaptation of a climate smart agriculture, because we know the problems that we have with climate change in the continent. And how it's been projected to play out. So doing some things might sound redundant to me, but I hope that the entire process, whatever these papers bring out, would have practical solutions to agriculture, to forestalling food insecurity in the continent, and not just be an exercise in writing a document. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those are all very interesting questions. So I hope our presenter here took good note of them. So you have a few minutes, and then so that you can provide some responses.
Thank you for the important questions. I will attempt to respond to some of them. The first one is how can the results be generalized to a whole country? Perhaps I should have mentioned that in each country, we worked in 3 agroecological zones. And so it's not like we are generalizing the results to all the agroecological zones. We are aware that in these countries, there are different agroecological zones. And so what we have brought out is applicable only to those selected agroecological zones. And so that applies to the crops, because each agroecological zones has got specific crops. I will speak in the context of Malawi, because I worked in the Lower Shiri Valley. It's a hot ecology, and there we grow a lot of sorghum and millet in that ecology, very hot ecology. And then moving up, we were in the mid ecology, where both maize and sorghum do well. It was in Lunzu area, that is in Blantyre district. And then further we went to the Lakeshore area in Salima district. Salima district is also hot, but not as hot as the Shire Valley. And there a lot of crops grow, including maize, legumes. You talk of sorghum, it does well. And so it's not like we are saying these technologies for all the crops. We were operating in a specific context. We're operating in a specific context. On controlling certain variables, that is a very technical question. I will not dare dive into an area that I'm not a specialist or an expert in, because we have our economist, Sarah, from Nigeria. And so I'll bring this issue to her attention so that she can perhaps look at what can be done in order to improve the paper. On incremental benefits of the adoption of CSA, we could have thought about capturing these in our study. Unfortunately, we did not factor in this question to probe and then bring out that information, which is very critical. But also, this is not an exercise in futility. If you take time to read our paper, we have made recommendations, very sound, that if governments consider the recommendations that we've put in there, perhaps we can move forward in terms of scaling out climate smart agricultural practices in these countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, you are free to leave. So I forgot to mention at the for each of these 6 papers that will be presented here, our discussants will help in evaluating these papers. So I hope you don't forget that. Our next paper is it's only presented by Usman Al-Hassan. The title is Rural Farmers' Perception of and Adaptations to Climate Change in Sub-Saharan Africa. Does climate smart agriculture matter in Nigeria and agriculture?
Okay. So, can I get it back? Okay. So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining this session. I'm Usman Al Hassan from the Graduate School of Economics in Japan. And I'll be making a presentation on behalf of my co-author, Emmanuel, who is currently in Nigeria for another research. In brief, our paper just tried to look at a generalized form of climate change perception and adaptation among rural farmers in Nigeria and Ethiopia. So rather than looking at some specific CSA practices, we try to look at some broad CSA adaptation. So just an overview of our motivation. From yesterday, it has been discussed about the challenges of climate change in Africa. Recent World Food Program and Food and Agricultural Organization study showed that 19 million and about 20 million Ethiopians and Nigerians face food insecurity. If we go further, the African Development Bank recently also published another report which states that achieving climate change adaptation by 2050 would require about 50 billion US dollars annually. So what we think is, although financing counts, what really is important is where the money goes and how it is being directed. And based on the objective of our study, we think financing the rural farmers should be one of the key areas we should be looking at. And in that respect, we try to look at the poor farmers who are really vulnerable to climate change, since they survive, they rely on agriculture and other climate-related factors that affect their well-being. What really is the perception of these farmers in terms of climate change? Do they have any mitigation factors that they adopt? And if they use climate-smart agricultural practices, what factors actually induce these adaptations? Just a side note, so to understand the first question, we see that using data from Afrobarometer latest survey, we see that both in Nigeria and Ethiopia, rural farmers really, when they were asked about climate change perception, what they understand by it, a lot of them, majority actually, do not understand what it means. But our data tends to show that despite the low response in terms of the perception, they actually adopt several CSA practices. An overview of the literature, because of time, I wouldn't get deep into it. So several studies have been conducted when we look at the literature regarding the issues of climate change perception and adaptation. But the angle we are coming from is try to look at the limitations of this study in terms of the single country analysis that were carried out in most cases, and a lot of them are region specific within certain countries. Then the sample sizes are usually very small in these countries. So we try to kind of explore the existing large data set from the household survey data set in Nigeria and the Ethiopian socioeconomic survey, which contains more than 5,000 households. But reducing our sample to the rural farmers, we were able to come up with about more than 2,500 unique households per country. Okay, so to measure perception, we try to look at if farmers really observe any changes in some weather conditions like rainfall, drought, flood, and pest infestation, and to look at the adaptation mechanisms or the techniques they adapt. We try to broadly classify the adaptation into water management, chemical management, land management, and organic fertilizer management. And these are some of the control variables we used in the study. So our estimation techniques broadly use 3 estimation techniques. First is the Heckman selection model, trying to address the issue of selection bias between perception and adaptation. Then we also use the multinomial logistics to look at the different combinations of adaptation measures that farmers use, and also the binary logistic regression. So the first set of results kind of shows us that we don't actually have issue of selection bias because our inverse males ratio is insignificant. But for Ethiopian farmers, the rural farmers tend to, whenever they have large plots of land, so their risk the exposure to climate change effects is larger. So they tend to have some adaptation of climate change. In the case of Nigeria, having a large plot size really, although positive, wasn't significant. For both farmers in rural Ethiopia and Nigeria, having a larger household size also tends to matter in terms of the perception of climate change. So this, we tend to interpret it to be that the larger the household, you are able to have more sources of information to understand what really climate change is. So the next set of results, we look at the multinomial logistic for Ethiopia, then next for Nigeria. So what we find is that higher income and large plots ownership or management tends to influence the adaptation of either one measure of the 4 categories I listed earlier, or all of them. But agricultural extension services seem to be a very important factor in terms of whether farmers are able to adopt certain CSA practices. Then social capital, which we measure as if a farmer lives within a community that practices a communal irrigation system. So for the case of Ethiopia, this seems to matter a lot. One interesting result is that farmers with higher levels of education are less likely to have to adopt some measures, but this result is actually explained in the further tables. So in the case of Nigeria also, high income and plot size seems to predict the adaptation of CSA practices. Similarly, agricultural extension services and social capital also in the case of Nigeria. Then lastly, the logistic regression again echoes the formal result from the multinomial logistic, showing that high income and plot size increases farmers' adoption of several measures like water management, chemical management, land management, and organic fertilizer. Agricultural extension services still remain important factor. Similarly, the social capital. In the case of Nigeria also, high-income households are more likely to adopt the CSA practices. Agricultural extension remains a very important factor. So to conclude, we think that understanding what drives farmers' perception of climate change and their choices to adopt CSA techniques is important for achieving food security in Africa and improving the welfare of rural farmers in African communities. And the findings that our results have shown is that farmers really have some adaptation techniques that they follow, which are being explained by their levels of income and the size of land they own. And also if they are exposed to agricultural extension programs, and whether they live within a community that helps them, that informs the adaptation that they take on. So policy-wise, we try to limit our policy clues into 3 areas. First is the dissemination of climate-related information, because from the earlier graphs we saw, farmers really tend to report not having any perception of climate change, even though they have some certain practices that they've been engaged in. So we think there is a need of bridging this communication gap. There have been a lot of research and policy issues, but we really do not have information. If farmers know about some of these research findings and scientific results that tends to guide adaptation. Then the next recommendation is that whenever policies are being implemented, our results show the importance of community network. So the social network shows policies should be implemented using a community-based approach. So what we mean is that you don't implement policy and allow every farmer on its own. It would make sense if you have a kind of community network, like the cases of the microfinance in Bangladesh, where you have people within a particular area, you give them the microfinance, there is more accountability. So similarly, it can work in the area of climate change CSE adaptation. And lastly, the issue of subsidy. Our results continuously shows that income matters a lot, but rural farmers are mostly poor. So it is imperative that government supports these farmers in terms of finance by providing low-cost financing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Al-Hassan. The discussant for this paper is Dr. Mukasa. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, the moderator. Thank you very much, the presenter, for this very good and important paper. I have a couple of suggestions that could help improve the quality of the paper. The first one is on the choice of Nigeria and Ethiopia. When I was reading the paper, I was not really convinced why you chose those two countries. If the question is because you have a large rural population in Nigeria and Ethiopia, I think that applies to almost all African countries. If the choice was guided by the fact that you have household surveys in Nigeria and Ethiopia, again, that applies to many African countries. For example, in Uganda, in Tanzania, and let's say Malawi, you have many household surveys that could also be used. So I think you need to make a very compelling case in your paper why you chose those two countries. The other aspect of the paper that I found was not clear enough when I was reading and even during the presentation, maybe because of time during the presentation, is why did you just restrict your sample to, I think, 1 or 2 years, 2018 and 2019? So in those two countries, you have many waves of household surveys, but you just decide to use one survey per country. I think when you do that, you are losing the dynamics of the concept that you want to analyze. We know that perceptions, habits, and beliefs takes time. So if you want to analyze those dynamics, I think you need a long-term perspective. I think that is missing in the paper. I think one suggestion would be either you use only one country and apply the dynamics, because you will be using many surveys. And this is important in your case, because at the end, the conclusion that you found for Nigeria seem to apply also to Ethiopia. So it's almost like you're analyzing the same country, because we don't see many significant differences in terms of recommendations, conclusion, and so on. So my suggestion would be either you apply a panel model so that you analyze the dynamics of perceptions, the dynamic of risks, or just select one country because the conclusion by the other country is almost the same. One of the main highlights of the paper, I think, is that income is important, farm size is important, and access to information is important. So the question is therefore, how do you help farmers increase their income? How do you help them increase farm size? How do you help them access to information? We have policy makers in this room. Some of them are attending this conference. So what do you say to them? What are the policy recommendations that you are giving to them in order to help those farmers to increase their income, to improve farm size, which is one of the key problems of Africa agriculture? So I think you may need to be more pragmatic in terms of policy recommendations so that the paper could be more useful in terms of the policy aspects. And one result that I found really intriguing is the fact that if I'm not wrong, in Ethiopia, you have many people that say that they are adopting, I think, adaptation measure. I think the rate was higher in Ethiopia than in Uganda. But at the end, the result was that the perception of climate risk was the other way around. So in country where people say that we feel more, we climate change, but they are not adopting adaptation measure. But in Nigeria, where they don't say that, you have the other way around in terms of the result. So it might be maybe important in the paper to explain that kind of contradictory result. One last aspect, I think this is more practical in the use of the Ekman models. If I'm not wrong, I think not only your selection, but also your outcome variable is binary. So it's dichotomous. And I'm not sure if in that case the Ekman model is applicable. It's like using an OLS on a binary model, because in the second stage modern.com model, you are using OLS controlled by the inverse Mills ratio. So I was wondering if you could maybe as a robustness check, instead of just restricting yourself to the Ekman model, maybe use what we call a censored probit model. So you have two types of probit model, and those that are linked by a corrected error model. So you can just test the two, if the error terms are not correlated, then you can just apply two different probit model. I think that might be helpful in terms of robustness of your paper. Otherwise, the paper was excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mukasa. We'll open the floor now to questions from the floor. Do we have the microphone still? It's there. Let me see. Looking for the microphone where, okay, it's okay. Good. Okay, we can start at the back. Is that Mr. Barrow?
Yes. Thank you very much, Usman, and thanks for the presenters and the discussion. I think what I found a bit surprising is the finding that the more educated the farmer, the less you adopt this climate smart agricultural practices or techniques or technologies. You know, I think the authors should really probe into that kind of finding, because it's like counterintuitive, and it doesn't also, you would expect that there's a correlation also positive between education, you know, and also access to information. So I find it a bit disturbing. Maybe it has something to do with the techniques used. So the authors should give us more clarification as to, and then also interestingly, you find that in Ethiopia, the adoption is higher than in Nigeria. What are the factors that really explain these differences? Thank you.
Thank you. I think yes, we can come around after you, the next row, and then we come in front here.
Okay, thank you very much. The study is interesting, and maybe just to echo the sentiments of the discussant about the comparison between the two countries, I find this a bit limited in terms of what factors would have driven the researchers to focus on these two countries. But interesting also in that would be the selection of rural communities, which brings me to the question that I have, or comment that I have. The selection of variables, I'm just wondering if there is possibility of including a variable that accounts for indigenous knowledge. Because if we are going to assume that learned farmers, educated farmers are not going to be utilizing CSA practices, is there anything that they know? And looking at the rural farmers themselves, assumption is that they have lots of ancestral knowledge that could be applied. I think for us, as we try to transform the sector, we also need to test what type of knowledge exists in our communities that can be applied, rather than just looking into what I would call modernized practices. Because in that way, we're sort of excluding our small farmers whom could have lessons that could be applied in our bigger and maybe commercial platforms. The issue of land ownership, the size of land, I missed this, whether CSA is being applied mostly in those that own larger land or smaller patches. But at the same time, if you look at experimentation, perhaps there's something to learn from those that are plowing or utilizing smaller patches of land in terms of what CSA practices exist there and which one of those can be scaled. The other one is on manure. there was a sense about utilization of fertilizer. Where I'm coming from, farmers are saying, we are next time not going to be utilizing this commercial manure. We need to find a way of producing our own manure, maybe the animal, but we have to find a way of replacing this. Can this have any implication in terms of what we see in degradation in the agricultural land? The last one is to do with information sharing, community networks. I think it applies also in terms of the type of community knowledge that exists. Of course, in tired communities will find that information passes more quickly. But to what extent is the information that farmers are utilizing in addressing, responding to climate issues, emerging from national platforms, the farmer support groups, the farmer extension workers, or just information that is being generated from the knowledge in terms of being able to sense changes in seasons and all those? Thank you.
Thank you. I think in front of you, yeah. So please let's keep the questions a bit concise so our presenter here is struggling to keep up with all of the questions. So I hope you got everything from that last one. Good.
No, I'll keep it very brief. Usman and team, thank you so much for the presentation. My question is around the climate services delivery, the issues around policies, around dissemination of climate-related information. There's been quite a lot of investments, especially at national and regional level in terms of dissemination of various climate services, particularly in relation to policy. So I'd like to really dig deeper on what is missing. Because we've spent time and money investing on regional entities that are doing various modeling. The forecasting processes and preparedness has really been enhanced across our region and our continent at large. What is missing to get that information at the appropriate time to the various end users? And what is lacking and what needs to be done in terms of policy and action to make a difference?
Thank you. And I think we can take one final one. Your hand has been up for a while, so if you can give her the microphone right here in front. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the floor, and thank you, presenter, for such a very interesting paper. I found two aspects of your paper very surprising. The first was with regards to educated farmers, which somebody has already asked, and I'm looking forward to hear the response. And the second was with regards to the perception of farmers on climate change. If I heard correctly, you meant farmers had no knowledge of the phenomenon of climate change. Is that correct? Yeah, because
maybe he can clarify.
Yeah, you need to clarify that, because what I took from that is that they are not, they couldn't tell you that climate change, they've experienced climate change or not. And I think this is a problem on our part as researchers, because we go with our terminologies and ask farmers, do you know about climate change? Of course, the answer will be no. If you go to my village, everybody doesn't know about climate change, but have they experienced it? The answer is yes. So we just have to find a good way of formulating our questions. What we typically do to farmers in villages in Ghana where I have worked is we ask them, what is your experience with farming? Have you experienced any change over the years? And then they will tell you exactly all the phenomenon, but they cannot give you the terms of climate change, of drought, of this or that. So we should be very careful in how we are formulating our questions, because it influences our answers and our responses and policy direction, but actually it's maybe not very correct. Thank you.
Thank you. I think so. We'll allow the presenter here. We can, yes. A few minutes to answer those questions. I hope you got everything.
Okay. Okay. Oh, thank you very much for the wonderful and insightful comments, suggestions, and the questions. So regarding first the choice of the years of the data set, we use the 2018 and 2019 household surveys in both Ethiopia and Nigeria. So the reason we restrict our sample to this period is that in the case of Ethiopia, we saw from the the baseline document for the survey, where it states that the 2018-2019 survey is more of a new kind of sampling. So it's not an extension from the existing surveys. So in this case, combining it to become a form of panel data would be mixing two different samples where the households are not the same across the two periods. So because we couldn't use the panel information for Ethiopia, we also limited it in the case of Nigeria also. So the other question regarding education, I think that came up a lot of times. So we found the result also quite surprising, but in the case of Nigeria, what we found after doing the binary logistic regression was that the educated farmers were more likely to adopt chemical management practices. This, we believe, are practices that require a lot of knowledge in terms of understanding the different fertilizers and modern chemicals, while for land management and water management and organic fertilizer, we saw negative correlation. This may be in part because the education variable is just a generalized variable of whether the farmer has attended school or not. So we didn't also factor in the issue of indigenous knowledge that these farmers have. So probably in improving the paper, we could include that aspect also. So the issue of knowledge sharing, so the variable we use is whether a farmer lives in a community where there is either an agricultural association in the case of Nigeria or some savings association. In the case of Ethiopia, the variable we found in the data set is whether the farmer engages in community irrigation system. So this is kind of a community network, the way we define the community network in our data set. And one other issue is the issue of perception and adaptation mismatch. So when we checked our data initially, we saw high level of adaptation, but low level of perception among the farmers. This was puzzling, but after checking with the Afrobarometer survey, which is an independent survey, our summary statistics kind of mirrored that of Afrobarometer. So this could be probably in terms of implementing the surveys. It may be that the way the questions were framed to the farmers were not very clear enough, because I also understand that farmers could really tell you if they experience a change in weather. In the case of Nigeria, northern Nigeria, I'm sure they will say changing Yenai or something like that, if you experience a change in kind of the weather and climate. So that may be where the problem came from. And the last thing I would like to talk about is the issue of our policy recommendation. So we emphasize the issue of information dissemination. So the way our results showed us is that farmers that are more exposed to agricultural extension programs, this has been a long practiced activity in a lot of African countries in terms of providing farmers with useful information. Like it has been discussed yesterday, using what we have to get what we want. This old practice can be revived and even extended. If more people can be trained to become better agricultural extension workers and being pushed into rural areas to help farmers understand the issues of climate change, and we believe this will scale up the adaptation among these rural farmers. I think that's all I can take up for now. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yes, Dr. Wabiri.
It's not a question. I just want to say maybe the other presenters can try to highlight, because when I'm hearing about climate smart agriculture, it's these things I did when I was very young. We used to do mulching, we used to do fertilizer, we used to do, rotation. So what is smart about it now? I think it is. Is it just a new terminology, or because then if that's the case, we should be talking about scaling up practices where they don't exist.
Yeah.
Maybe the next presenters can
Yes.
highlight that.
Is it all wine in a new bottle, as they say?
Sounds like.
Yeah, so it's I think that's a very good point. So when you say the terminology can include many things in different contexts. What is climate smart in one context? I mean, depends on what the impact of climate in that particular area. So it will be important as you present your papers, as my colleague has pointed out here, to be a bit more specific what climate smart or resilient activities mean in that particular context. Thank you for highlighting that. So the next paper is Geospatial and Time-Dependent Analysis of Agricultural Drought Vulnerability in Africa by Dr. Durga J. You have yes. And the discussant will be my colleague, Dr. George Kararaj.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this presentation titled Geospatial and Time-Dependent Analysis of Agricultural Drought Vulnerability in Africa Towards Climate Smart Agriculture. I'm Dr. Durga, lecturer at University of Mascara in Mauritius. So first of all, an overview of the agricultural context. As we all know, agriculture remains the backbone of Africa's economy. It employs a share of 70% of the continental workforce and contributes on average 40% of the GDP. The cash crop economy is an important one in the continent and contributes to export revenues, which help support development-driven local economic growth. Presently, a share of more than 90% of staples being produced in Africa is derived mostly from rain-fed systems, with less than 10% being produced under irrigation. According to the IPCC, under the business as usual scenario, temperature is projected to rise by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, which means that dry regions will become even drier with climate change. And this will cause additional stresses on the agricultural sector, especially the rain-fed one. An empirical analysis conducted in the continent revealed that a 14% reduction in precipitation would cause a $3.8 billion deficit. So despite the fact that there has been increasing number of investments made across the continent, there exists a big finance gap when it comes to adapting the agricultural system to climate change impacts. So strategies need to be implemented in order to conserve crops of high economic values in the face of climate change. So to frame the current issue, actually, as I've mentioned previously, there exists a budget deficit for agricultural financing, which means that with a limited budget, there is a need to identify highly vulnerable rain-fed agricultural lands and the cash crop cultivation in order to assess the economic potential of those drought-impacted areas, so as to implement proportionate strategies depending on the economic extent of the damage. So the rationale behind the current study is that the major share of the budget needs to be directed towards the more heavily impacted cash crop economies across the continent. So the first analysis that will be conducted is a climate one, second one is an economic assessment, and third one are policy recommendations. So proceeding to climate analysis, actually 39-year precipitation trends from 1981 to 2019 across the continent was analyzed, and which helped reveal severe water deficit pockets across the continent. So the red region shown here are actually drought-prone areas across the continent, which has been analyzed thanks to satellite imageries during this time scale and geospatial information. And actually, one of the main conclusions of the current study is that this decade has registered a reduction in precipitation by up to 15%, mostly in the semi-arid and the desert climate regions. However, since the focus of the current study is on the agricultural sector, so agricultural croplands areas were identified using remote sensing techniques, and of these areas, so the rain-fed regions were demarcated. So the rain-fed regions are the purple regions in the second image to the right. And actually, the overlap between the rain-fed regions, or the purple regions, and the regions experiencing rainfall deficits, or the red regions, would indicate the vulnerability of rain-fed croplands to drought impacts, to climate change impacts. And to the extreme right, you can see that it was graded from severely impacted, so the red regions, to moderately impacted croplands to drought impacts. Now, this is the climate analysis. Proceeding to the economic assessment, Actually, a mapping of cash crop yields in tons per hectares were conducted across the continent for different cash crop types, from cassava, cereal, sweet potato, etc., in tons per hectares across the continent using FAO data. FAO had also published the producer price, how it varies for each of these cash crop in US dollars per ton. So the producer price as well has a geospatial component. So what this analysis essentially does at this stage is that I will just multiply the producer price value actually for a particular cash crop, say for instance for maize in US dollars per tons, and I will multiply it actually by the cash crop yields in tons per hectares, how it varies. So tons will cancel out. I will obtain the economic yield, how it varies for this particular cash crop in US dollars per hectare. I would repeat the process for another cash crop, say for instance for wheat, and do it for all the different cash crops shown here. So I will obtain the overall economic yield of the combined cash crops, how it varies from place to place in the continent. However, since the focus of a current study is how it varies in the rate deficit areas in the first analysis that we've conducted is shown here. So the economic yield varies from a low value of 2,000 US dollars per hectare in the rain deficit areas to a high value of 25,000 US dollars per hectare. So of course, we'll want to actually conserve the high value crop yields. So the purple regions identified in this map, but which are vulnerable to drought impacts. And the second, actually, by summing economic values of all cash crops for every hectare of a severely impacted regions would give an indication of the economic extent of the damage caused. So the second main conclusion of the current study is that the rain-fed cash crops of Nigeria is by far the most significantly impacted by a reduction in precipitation, tantamounting to 314 million US dollars. This is followed by the region of Morocco, Algeria, Senegal, Kenya, and Nigeria. So in order to conserve cash crops of high economic values and to adapt the agricultural sector to climate change impacts, climate-smart agricultural strategies need to be implemented. And actually, we note in literature that the low adoption rates of climate-smart agricultural measures in the continent, owing to, especially in the rural communities, owing to complex legal, technical, financial, institutional barriers. So in order to de-risk CSA interventions across the continent, the following are proposed based on an extensive literature review. So enhancing access to finance and services in the regions identified, so the drought-impacted regions identified. So enhance access to rural credit loans, microfinance, high-quality certified seeds, and subsidization of agricultural insurance. Also modernization of infrastructures, so improve rural agricultural infrastructures, including telecommunications network for enhanced climate information coverage, roads for enhanced market access, solar-powered irrigation technologies, and also to satisfy the mitigation pillar of CSA measures, so exploiting carbon uptake, so exploiting value chains for agroforestry, tapping to the REDD+ financial mechanism, and promoting domestic biogas system. To address the gender gap issue, so setting up women-only credit schemes, promotion of women participation in cooperative movements, amending customer land tenure systems, discriminating women's access to land resources. So, of course, none of the above would work without a proper governance system. So promoting cross-sectoral collaborations, improving efficiency of institutions, and harnessing indigenous knowledge. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to end with a following quote, which I cannot find on the screen. Yeah, it's supposed to appear, yeah. Well, we must move towards climate-smart agriculture. It's all right. I will end on that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good. No, thank you. Mr. Kararaj, the discussant will offer his. Yes. Okay. Switch it on. Is it on?
So thank you, Dr. J. Is that Dr. J, right? So thank you very much. So I read this on the plane, and that's a confession. The first thing I like the most is the very nice picture of Africa with all the colorings and stuff. and it's not a joke. Now, I think that increasingly agrometeorological data is coming to be used constantly, and I think that is a positive development, because it gives you some precision in terms of where the drought areas are and where the floods are and so on. The only thing it doesn't tell you though is where they will be. So I don't know whether in terms of the data, we can actually use this historical data for forecasting or simulating potential areas or where things are going to happen in about a year. So for me, this is dominantly historical data. It doesn't tell you, or it can tell you maybe 2 days, 3 days ago, 5 days ago, 1 month, but it doesn't tell you what will happen tomorrow unless you spend time and do some modeling to focus based on this data. But what I'm saying is that for me, the appealing part of this paper is the fact that you are prioritizing numbers, the importance of data in influencing policy conversation. And so the rest of the motivation, the importance, the link between agriculture and weather vulnerabilities and all of that, I agree. And I think most of us in this room would also agree that there's a very strong relationship between yields and weather conditions. Now, and it's not a quarrel with your paper alone. I think the last 3 papers I've listened to, I still leave a little bit confused like Dr. Jerry there. What is it we are talking about when we are talking about climate smart agriculture? What is it? And that question needs to at least be answered in the literature review to conceptualize, so that the policy recommendations you come with on gender, on finance, I don't see, after looking at your satellite pictures, I don't see the link between those recommendations and the satellite pictures elsewhere. And so that comes to my point about issues around the approach. I think that you could use a relatively, and I think it's in the literature, right? Climate smart landscape management. And that approach, actually, there's a lot of discussion, for example, on land tenure systems, on selection of seeds to be used. Do you use legumes against other types of crops? Issues around intercropping. Legumes are known to retain nitrogen in the soil. That has some effect on soil fertility and all of that. So these are adaptation measures, if you want me to call it that. But the other thing that I also found, and maybe is an issue with the call for the papers, there's only emphasis on adaptation. I did not hear any word about mitigation. And I think that mitigation should be part of that conversation. And so when you're talking about the importance of gender, for sure, in my head, I can see the link between climate vulnerability and gender issues. And I can see the link between gender empowerment and ability to respond to climate shocks, right? But I don't see it in the paper. So that's the point. The other point that I think in terms of landscape approach as opposed to climate specific use of the word climate smart agriculture as opposed to climate smart landscape management is the fact that if you talk about tenure systems, restoration of landscapes and all of that, I think that is in itself responding to climate vulnerabilities. And I think it is a much more broader and more dynamic approach in my view, unless you really define what you mean by climate smart agriculture. I think that you get a reader lost in that regard, because I think if you're recommending, for example, governance issues around, for example, how you restore forest cover, that to me sounds like climate smart agriculture, actually, because you are developing your carbon sink, you're reducing on emission. If you're changing farming systems, livestock, for example, is known to be a very big player in carbon emissions. If you are going to change that, I think that is not adaptation per se, that could be considered mitigation. So those conceptual issues, I think if they're clarified, I think the paper is going to be very useful. The bird's eye view on all the problems in the north, but these are dominantly also very dry areas, right? I didn't see the floods areas. I don't know where that might be. I was expecting Uganda to be included in the flood areas, but apparently the map of Kenya is also showing the kind of drier part of Kenya as opposed to those parts where you have more rain. So let me stop there. But anyway, generally, I think the use of these technologies to harvest data and inform policy, I think is a positive development. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kararaj. We'll now open the floor to, let me see, I have 1, 2, 3 hands up. So I'll start in front here. Is the, okay. Let's give them the, no, people are connected virtually. They may not hear. Yes, and over there, no, in front.
Yeah, so I'll try to be very fast. Great presentation. To be honest, this is a very great mapping exercise you did, looking at kind of a continent-wide study, and I really enjoyed your presentation. And I can imagine if I was looking at your paper, I'm even going to enjoy it more. But one thing I have that relates more to what the discussion said is really on your policy recommendations. It really stays afloat from the whole presentation. So most of them were really generic. They felt like they just fell from somewhere. And these are really good recommendations. But sometimes we really need to pin these things to evidence, right? So I don't know whether it's because your presentation was short. I don't expect you to answer, but I'm just trying to suggest that next time I'm trying to get us understand your policy recommendations better. Thank you.
Okay. So these two here in front, we have. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I found them very, very beautiful and very, very clear. What I have to say is not really a question, but a general comment based on the discussions going on so far about CSA, that CSA really has 3 pillars: increase in productivity, adaptation to climate change, and mitigation. And the practice is classified as climate smart agriculture if it can meet any of those 2 pillars. That's all. And as rightly mentioned by one of the discussants, most of these technologies are not new at all. We have known them for decades. In most of the communities around Africa, they already exist. But what is new in this approach is the integrated way that we are looking at things and to fit them within the pillars. So they are just old technologies with a new branding, and we are trying to integrate things. That is CSA, simply put. Thank you.
Thank you. Right in front here.
I think for me, because I went back to my special analyst background, and he asked you about the predictive ability of the model. I just wanted to clarify, the only factor you are considering is rainfall. I think that limits your analysis because there is a lot of spatial modeling that exists. You can even include income in your model, you can include soil, you can include so many. So there are a lot of geographically weighted regression models that you can use, but maybe, and that allows you to be able to do the predictive aspects of the model. So if you could consider that, I know location accounts for everything that we cannot count. But I think the things that we can count that you can include in the model would make it more interesting. And also to show the aspect of time. How do you move from this year to that year? It would be interesting to see the trend. When you talk of temporal trend, I want to see what's happening from this year to this year and how that changes the productivity and the income of the farmers. Maybe that's something.
We have time for one more at the back. Way at the back. Yes, thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Very good study. I just wanted to chip in something on this, the predictive analytics part of the work. There's a lot of work that's already been done in the continent. Tons of work. And there's so many institutions who are working on predictive analytics. So you don't even need to reinvent the wheels. It is more or less connecting to the institutions or the body of work that's already been done and then tweaking it to suit the purposes or the objectives of this study. Starting a whole new process all of its own could be a little bit odious, but if you want to take advantage of the body of knowledge that already exists, and most of this, some of the predictive analytics works is also as a connection with climate and it has different properties that it is considering as part of the body of work. Also, from the economic point of view, there's also some seminal work that ECA has done, prospective analysis, that you could also see how you integrate that into this work to make it a little bit more robust. Thank you.
Thank you. Let the presenter attempt to answer those questions. You can have this one.
Thank you very much for your questions. Yeah, regarding the policy recommendations, for sure, actually, unfortunately, I learned about this paper submission 3 weeks before. So yeah, there was not much time to delve into that. Of course, policy recommendations, we need, actually this presentation was the first stage of this analysis actually, to identify the drought impacted areas. There is a second stage to it now. Now in these drought impacted areas, we need to investigate the right policy mechanisms in those drought impacted areas. There is a very important stage to that. Unfortunately, due to lack of time, I could not delve into that, but for sure, it's a future recommendations. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Madam, for the elaborations on CSA measures, and CSA, the 3 pillars of CSA. And considering the multiple factors, yes, of course, actually this study was very specific to drought impacts, actually. So looking into space, actually not very much on time scale, and identify highly critical drought impacted areas. Of course, this study can be further extended and include a lot of other factors, just like you mentioned, in terms of temperature, in terms of landscape factors, in terms of geography, and to really look into the most vulnerable areas of these vulnerable areas identified. So this factor will take into consideration. In terms of the temporal analysis, yes, this can be done, but unfortunately, there was so much data already that I've analyzed in this presentation there, and my performance power of my computer would not allow for more analysis. Now, in terms of this information being already available, actually, unfortunately, no, there is not much information which is available for a 30. Actually, this analysis was conducted for a 40 years period, from 1981 to 2022. So no, there is not much data available in the continent of Africa, which is updated like this. That's the importance of the current study, actually. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, I think so. We are running a little bit behind. We've been doing very well on time, but unfortunately, we are still going a bit, running a bit behind schedule. So the next paper is Understanding the Gender Differences on the Choice of Portfolio of Climate Smart Agricultural Practices in Sub-Saharan Africa. The presenter is Dr. Hail Mariam Tekulwal, and the discussant will be Dr. Yaya Koloma. Is he connected online? Okay, good. Please. Thank you. So let's give the floor to Dr. Tekulwal.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, and then good afternoon. My talk today is on understanding the gender differences on the adoption of different type of this climate smart agricultural practices in some African countries. This is a study sponsored by African Economic Research Consortium. As a background, as we know, in this region, agricultural production is highly vulnerable to the changing of climate. This mainly because of agriculture is dependent on rain, sensitive to climate, And then farmers have limited adaptive capacities so that they are very vulnerable to climate changes. Therefore, in an era where this climate change is an important issue in agricultural development, there should be ex-ante measures that are needed to develop resilience, mainly through increasing the adoption of different type of these practices. And then actually, we define climate smart practices are on-farm intervention that basically enhance food security while meeting climate change mitigation and then adaptation. This includes different practices, including the cropping system diversification, water management, pest management, improved seeds, and organic fertilizers. In most developing countries, as we know, and then most literature has indicated, investment on agriculture is very low. And then on top of that, gender differences in adoption of these practices are very low. It's mainly because of lower initial endowments. They have this limited bargaining power. They have limited this access to financial resources or institutional services. Thus, women and men farmers have different abilities because of these abilities to adapt to climate change. And then there are quite several literatures that has been studied on this issue. Most of the previous studies on gender in adoption of technology used this so-called this unitary household model, where they basically assume household head is the only decision-making unit. And then these studies basically provide limited information about the small segment of women producers in female-headed households. And they mainly ignores the majority of women farmers in male-headed households who actually own resources and are responsible for decisions on the plot they manage. So that with this background, the main knowledge gap with the previous studies is that given that empirical evidence favor this collective or bargaining model of the household and reject this unitary model, interest is gradually growing more to the role of intra-household decision-making and gender dimension of control resources to facilitate the adoption of different type of technologies. And yet not much is known about the gender role played by intra-household resource dynamics in the adoption of different type of adaptation practices. For instance, the right to own, the right to manage, and the right to control of resources among men and women in a given household. There is also a paucity of adaptation research that systematically analyze whether gender disaggregated farm owned or managed individually or jointly by men, women, or both differ in the adoption of different type of adaptation options. So that the main objective of this study is to test gender differential in adoption rates of sets of yield increasing, risk protecting, and resource conserving practice, which is the main characteristic of climate smart agricultural practices in some African countries, including Ethiopia, Tanzania, Malawi, and Nigeria. And also the study examined the effect of intra-household bargaining power among household heads and spouses on the adoption of the different type of climate smart agricultural practices. And then the contribution of this study provide discussion on gender and technology adoption by focusing not only the role who manage the plot among the head and the spouse, solely and jointly, but also we in this study also emphasize how managerial rights, the right to make farming decision, coupled with the right to own the plot and the right to control output from the plots are distributed, and then how such structure of land, structure of rights, the combination of this structure of rights influences the adoption of the different type of practices. As a methodology, as I said before, we focus on 4 countries. The main reason why we focus is because of this data availability. And then we use this, the World Bank's LSMS data, Living Standard Measurement Survey data. The data covered 2 rounds. Actually, LSMS collects several rounds of data, but we only cover we only take 2 rounds because of data issues. And then as you see, the sample size is quite large, more than 6,000 households, and then we consider each plot level data, so that, for instance, in Ethiopia, we consider more than 42,000 plots, and then in Malawi, you consider more than 10,000 plots. This is the distribution of plot management, plot ownership, and then output controls in different countries. We have seen that there is heterogeneous results among countries in terms of management, ownership, and then control of resources. The results differ across countries. This is a distribution of the patterns of adoption of the different practices by management, ownership, and control of plots. This is the adoption of the different climate smart practices that we group those practices as yield increasing, risk protecting, and resource conserving practices. Econometric approach, I didn't present here the technical econometric issue, but conceptually we focus on farmers that are often face a bundle of different practices that adopt simultaneously as increasing yield, resource conserving, and risk protection. And then the decision about technology adoption usually involve contribution from the different household members, individually or jointly. So that our empirical approach is based on this collective model of the households. And then in terms of econometric, we use this random effects topic model because we construct an index of our dependent variable is index of household adoption decision on portfolio of say practice, which takes the values between 0 and 1. In terms of results, I can just present the main results. We find significant gender difference in adoption rate due to the overlap between gender-based management economic rights over the plots. For instance, in Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Nigeria, adopting this practice on individually managed plot by men and women is positive if the output from the plot is also controlled either by men or women individually. In Malawi, on individual as well as joint plot manager, adoption rate is more likely if the output is also controlled jointly by men and women. This is actually agrees with the previous results, and then if wives control the outputs may gain higher bargaining power and households likely to adopt technologies, and then the result probably suggests that beyond the right to management decision, gender inclusive land rights also require a clear understanding of the economic rights from the plots. It's not only the ownership, it's also the economic rights, controlling the economic rights from the plots. The other issue is that the role of gender in plot management right intersects with the plot ownership and output control. We found that women are more likely to increase adoption rate on the plot they own and manage. This probably is an indication on women's tenure, security, and access to other rights that basically enhance their bargaining power to choose and then adopt the different practices. And then we also found that women plot manager increased adoption rate on men-owned plots in Nigeria, and then in Tanzania on jointly owned plot. This may imply the possible intra-household cooperation between spouses on the management and then ownership of the household resources. As a conclusion, farmers' ability to adapt to changes in extreme weather events depends on access to productive resources and institutional support for adaptation. That should be gender sensitive and aim to capture both women and men farmers' preferences. Given women's important roles and responsibilities in the agricultural production, there is a growing interest in the literature to understand the gender technology adoption gaps and the potential factors that restricts men and women within the household from increasing the adoption rate of different type of strategies. And then the findings probably indicate that gender differentiate the resource entitlement and decision-making, thereby increasing adoption of a combination of practices. And then some policy implication, the result probably suggests that beyond the right ownership, which most countries provide to the householders, gender inclusive land rights also require a clear understanding of the management, the plot management is beyond the ownership, and also the economic rights, controlling the economic rights from the plots, empowering women in terms of the right on and manage and land and control of economic rights from all it, as well as to get access to education and other financial resources. And then based on that, designing agricultural intervention in the setting of cooperation and joint interest among household members could increase the adoption of this climate.
that, we also see that the bundle use of these practices matter. So it's not just about adopting one of the practices, but if you adopt more than one of these practices, we observe different kinds of relations on your yields and on your food security. And directly, because of these results,